April 5th, 1994. The shotgun never fired. Now you will hear the version of the story no one ever imagined. Kurt Cobain woke up in that greenhouse above Lake Washington, drenched in cold sweat and existential terror. The weapon lay beside him, cold metal against wooden floor. His hands trembled violently as he stared at the instrument of his intended escape. Something had stopped him at the final moment. Perhaps it was the distant sound of Frances Bean laughing through baby monitors in the main house. Perhaps it was sheer exhaustion winning over despair. Perhaps it was the last flicker of curiosity about what tomorrow might hold. He would never articulate the reason, not even to himself. What he knew with crushing certainty was that the weight pressing down on his exhausted soul had not lifted. It had merely paused, hovering like a shadow waiting to consume him again. The intervention came swiftly. Courtney found him unconscious hours later, rushed him to Swedish Medical Center, where doctors pumped his stomach and psychiatrists asked questions he couldn't answer. The media firestorm was immediate and merciless. Cobain's cry for help screamed Rolling Stone. Grunge icon's near-death experience declared MTV News. Fans held candlelight vigils outside the hospital, praying for their reluctant messiah. But no one understood the chaotic silence behind the music, the void that fame had carved into his chest, the agony of being worshipped by millions who couldn't see his pain. Recovery became his new prison. Court-ordered rehab, mandatory therapy sessions where he sat silent, picking at his fingernails while doctors tried to decode his demons. Interviews where journalists asked him to explain the unexplainable. How do you articulate the desire to vanish when your existence gives meaning to strangers? How do you confess that success feels like suffocation? But something unexpected happened during those dark months of 1994. In the enforced stillness of treatment, away from stages and screaming crowds, Kurt began writing again, not for albums or concerts, just of himself. Raw, acoustic melodies that poured out of him like blood from a wound. These songs were different from Nirvana's Assault. They were quieter, more vulnerable, devastatingly honest. He filled notebooks with lyrics about fatherhood, about wanting to be better, about the terror of living and the cowardice of dying. Would Nirvana survive this crisis? That question consumed the music world throughout late night. Dave Grohl watched his friend with desperate concern. Chris Novoselic suggested they take indefinite time off, maybe record acoustic material, anything to ease the crushing pressure. But the machine of fame kept grinding. Record labels demanded new albums, promoters offered millions for tours, MTV wanted unplugged specials. The industry that had built Kurt Cobain into an icon now needed him to perform his resurrection. In September 1994, Nirvana made a stunning announcement. They were going on hiatus. Indefinite. No breakup, just silence. Kurt released a handwritten statement that became instantly iconic. I need to learn how to be human again, before I can be a musician. Thank you for understanding what I can't explain. The grunge era continued without its reluctant king. Pearl Jam grew bigger. Soundgarden released Super Unknown. Alice in Chains descended into their own darkness. But something had shifted in the cultural zeitgeist. Kurt's survival, his public struggle, had opened conversations about mental health that rock culture had always suppressed. Masculinity in the 90s began cracking, allowing vulnerability to seep through. Kurt spent 1995 in relative obscurity. He moved out of the Seattle spotlight to a small ranch in rural Washington. Courtney visited when she could. Their relationship still volatile, still complicated, somehow gentler. Frances Bean became his anchor. He learned to be present, to play with his daughter without the chemical buffer of heroin. The stomach pain that had tortured him for years finally got proper diagnosis, a treatable condition that previous doctors had missed or ignored. Without the physical agony, his reliance on opiates began to loosen, though the psychological grip remained fierce. What was happening to his music during this silence? The world wondered constantly. Underground tapes began circulating in 1996. Bootlegs of Kurt playing small coffee shops in Portland and Olympia, sometimes solo, sometimes with local musicians no one recognized. These performances were nothing like Nirvana. No distortion, no screaming, just one man with an acoustic guitar singing songs that made grown men cry. The lyrics cut deeper than anything he'd written before. Francis was a lullaby about fatherhood and fear. Still Here was a meditation on survival that felt like listening to someone's suicide note in reverse. Music critics who obtained these recordings called them the most important unreleased material in rock history. But Kurt wasn't ready to release them officially. He was still learning to exist without self-destruction as his companion. Therapy slowly revealed the childhood trauma, the undiagnosed ADHD, the chronic depression that had shadowed him since adolescence. He began understanding himself not as a tortured artist, but as a sick person who happened to make art. The romantic notion of the suffering genius started to disgust him. By 1997, the world had changed around him. Grunge was dying, murdered by its own success, and the rise of pop-punk and nu metal. Marilyn Manson was the new moral-matic. The Spice Girls dominated MTV. Technology was evolving rapidly. The internet was spreading, creating new ways for fans to connect and artists to share music. Without corporate gatekeepers, Kurt watched from his ranch, fascinated by the democratization of music that was beginning. Then came an unexpected phone call in early 1998. Michael Stipe from REM reached out, invited Kurt to collaborate on a quiet, experimental project. No pressure, no notion, just two artists exploring sound. Kurt agreed, cautiously. The sessions in Athens, Georgia were revelatory. Working with Stipe, who had navigated fame without self-immolation, showed Kurt that survival was possible. They recorded an album's worth of material that blended folk, ambient sounds, and brutally honest lyrics. It was unlike anything either had done before. Could Kurt Cobain reinvent himself? The question terrified and excited him. The album, released under the name Echo Chamber in late 1998, shocked everyone. Critics didn't know how to categorize it. Fans were divided. Some called it a betrayal of everything Nirvana represented. Others heard it as growth, as an artist refusing to be trapped by his past. The album sold moderately. Nothing like Nirvana's numbers, but Kurt didn't care. For the first time in his career, he had created something without the suffocating weight of expectation crushing him. Meanwhile, Dave Grohl's Foo Fighters had become stadium-filling rock giants. Christ played with various projects, content in semi-obscurity. The three former Nirvana members rarely spoke. Their shared trauma too immense to address, but there was no bitterness, just distance. As the millennium approached, Kurt found himself at a crossroads. He was 32 years old, alive when everyone had expected him dead. The 90s were ending, and with them, the future that had created and nearly destroyed him. The 2000s promised something different: digital revolution, reality TV, a sanitized version of rebellion. Where did an authentic voice fit in a world increasingly driven by manufactured authenticity? In 1999, Kurt made a decision that would define his second act. He bought a small recording studio in Olympia and opened it to young, unknown artists. He produced records for kids who reminded him of himself at 19. Angry and desperate to be heard, he taught them about the industry's traps, about protecting your art and your sanity. He became a mentor, channeling his pain into helping others avoid his mistakes. But the creative drive hadn't died. In private, he was writing the most ambitious material of his life. Not rock songs, but something closer to sonic poetry. He collaborated with ambient artists, experimental musicians, even classical composers. These sessions remained mostly unreleased, existing as rumors and occasional leaked tracks that spread through early file-sharing networks like Napster. The digital music revolution fascinated and worried him. File sharing was destroying the corporate music industry that he'd always despised, but it was also devaluing music itself. Kids expected everything free. Artists struggled to make livings. The democratization he'd hoped for was creating a different kind of exploitation. Kurt wrote essays about it, published on early blogs, warning about the unintended consequences of disruption. Then came September 11, 2001, The world changed overnight. The irony and cynicism that defined the 90s evaporated in smoke and terror. Suddenly everyone wanted sincerity, patriotism, unity. Kurt watched the towers fall on television and felt the collective trauma reopen his personal wounds. The numbness he'd fought so hard to overcome threatened to return. He didn't relapse, but the temptation screamed louder than it had in years. In 2002, on Francis Bean's 10th birthday, Kurt did something unprecedented. He reunited with Dave and Chris for a single performance at a small Seattle venue benefiting 9/11 first responders. They played Nirvana songs for the first time in 8 years. The performance was raw, emotional, imperfect. Kurt cried openly during Heart-Shaped Box. Dave's drums hit harder than ever. Chris's bass rumbled with barely contained grief. It wasn't a reunion, it was an exorcism. The bootleg of that night became the most downloaded music file in early internet history. Fans begged for more. The band refused. It had been a moment, not a resurrection. But something had shifted in Kurt. Performing those songs with his old friends reminded him why he'd started making music. Not for fame or money, but for connection. For the possibility that shared pain might become collective catharsis. What came next would reshape his legacy completely. In 2003, Kurt released his first solo album under his own name. Survival Guilt was unlike anything in mainstream rock. It was acoustic, intimate, unflinchingly honest about addiction, mental illness, and the burden of being the voice of a generation he'd never asked to represent. The lead single, Still Breathing, became an unexpected hit, not on rock stations, but on adult contemporary radio. Middle-aged listeners who'd aged out of grunge found something in Kurt's weathered voice that spoke to their own compromises and endurance. The album went platinum, not through hype but through word of mouth and early social media sharing. Kurt toured small theaters, not arenas. He talked to audiences between songs, answering questions, admitting he didn't have all the answers. These shows became legendary for their intimacy. Fans left feeling like they'd witnessed therapy sessions disguised as concerts. By 2005, Kurt Cobain had achieved something impossible. He'd survived fame and emerged as an elder statesman of authenticity. Younger artists cited him as an influence, not for Nirvana's aggression, but for his refusal to be destroyed by the industry. He appeared on panels about mental health and addiction. He testified before Congress about healthcare reform. He used his platform differently now, not as a reluctant spokesman, but as someone who'd earned his authority through suffering and survival. His relationship with Courtney had evolved into something stranger than marriage or divorce. They remained connected, co-parenting Francis Bean, occasionally collaborating on music, but living separate lives. The toxicity had mellowed into toltekud, affection. They both changed. Both survived themselves. As the 2000s progressed, Kurt became increasingly interested in visual art. He'd always sketched and painted, but now he approached it seriously. His exhibitions in small galleries featured disturbing, beautiful pieces that explored themes of fame, identity, and resurrection. Critics compared him to Jean-Michel Basquiat, another artist who'd channeled his demons into multiple mediums. In 2008, during the financial crisis, Kurt released another album, The Long Decline, that captured the moment's despair. It was his darkest work since the 90s, but tempered with hard-won wisdom, songs about economic collapse, failing systems, and enduring anyway. It resonated with a generation facing their own apocalypse. Then, in 2010, something no one expected happened. Nirvana reunited. Not permanently, but for a carefully planned tour celebrating the 20th anniversary of Nevermind. Kurt was 43 now, gray in his hair, lines in his face, but still possessing that voice. They played arenas again, but differently. Kurt spoke openly about his struggles between songs. They donated all proceeds to mental health organizations. The shows were celebrations and memorials simultaneously, honoring both their younger selves and all they'd survived. The final performance in Seattle felt like closure. Kurt stood on stage where he'd once wanted to disappear and thanked the audience for letting him grow up in public, for forgiving his absence, for understanding that surviving sometimes means vanishing for a while. But no one could predict what this decision would change. The reunion sparked something unexpected. A wave of 90s nostalgia swept through culture. Grunge fashion returned. Young bands cited Nirvana as primary influences, but more importantly, conversations about mental health in music exploded. Kurt's openness about his ongoing struggles gave permission for countless artists to admit their own battles. The romantic tragedy narrative he'd escaped began to crumble across the industry. By 2015, Kurt was 48. Frances Bean was an adult, healthy, creative, unburdened by her parents' mythology. That might have been his greatest achievement. He'd broken the cycle. He continued making music, increasingly experimental, increasingly unconcerned with commercial success. His late-period work would never match Nirvana's cultural impact. But it possessed something more valuable: earned serenity. Looking back from this alternate timeline, the question becomes, what did the world gain by Kurt Cobain's survival? A catalog of later albums that ranged from brilliant to indulgent. A voice advocating for mental health and artistic integrity. A visible example that the tortured artist doesn't have to die young to create meaningful work. Proof that redemption, though never complete, remains possible. His survival didn't erase his earlier pain or make the music less valid. It added chapters to a story everyone thought had ended. It complicated the mythology in necessary ways. Kurt Cobain living meant watching a brilliant, damaged person struggle toward wholeness, failing often, succeeding sometimes, but always continuing. In an industry that devours its wounded, his mere existence became revolutionary, and what came next would reshape rock music forever. Not through his death becoming legend, but through his life demonstrating that legends can choose to remain human. The man who'd wanted to disappear learned, slowly and painfully, to be visible on his own terms, and somehow, impossibly, that was enough.